you want to avoid cancer? Then avoid processed foods. Another way of saying that is, do you want to increase your risk for cancer? Then eat more processed foods. I'm Dr. John Bartemus, and I'm putting the pieces together to help you live a life at optimal. Recent research that is cutting edge and hot off the press from the British Medical Journal dove into ultra-processed food in the U.S. diet and looked at how much of the average American diet is made up of ultra-processed food, and then how does ultra-processed food affect cancer risk in the American population. The first study looked at 10,000 Americans and studied how much of their diet was made up of ultra-processed food. Before we dive in there, we want to know or define ultra-processed food. In the study, they defined ultra-processed foods as ultra-processed foods were defined as industrial formulations which, besides salt, sugar, oil, and fats, also include substances, in particular additives used to imitate sensorial qualities of minimally processed foods in their culinary preparations. So they have basically frankenfoods, and then they're adding additives to make the frankenfoods taste like foods they're mimicking from nature. But obviously the ultra-processed foods have a ton more sugar added and industrial fats added to make them more palatable. So what this study found was that ultra-processed foods comprise 60% of the typical American's energy intake, meaning ultra-processed foods made up 60% of the calories that the average American eats in a day. That is wowzer, because that's saying that 60% of your calories are processed high-sugar foods. So how does that correlate with cancer risk and cancer disease in the United States? Well, this one's super hot off the press. This is a 2018 study, British Medical Journal, and it's titled "The Consumption of Ultra-Processed Foods and Cancer Risk." This study looked at 105,000 people, so a huge study. And what they did was they compared ultra-processed food intake to risk of overall cancer, specifically prostate, colon, and breast. So if you have a family history of prostate, colon, or breast cancer and you don't want it, one modifiable risk factor would be limiting the amount of processed food you're consuming. So this study found that a 10% incremental increase in the amount of processed food you eat raises your risk of cancer overall by 12%. So that's huge. Increasing your total caloric intake 10% with processed foods, or changing out your total caloric intake. If you had a 100% clean diet and you took out 10% clean and added 10% processed, that's raising your cancer risk 12% right there. So that's only 300, if you're a typical American eating 2,000 to 2,400 calories a day, that's only 200 to 240 calories of processed food a day, increases your risk of cancer up to 12%. That's like one processed granola bar or one small snack, and most people don't eat just one. That previous study said most people eat 60% of their calories that way. So the math gets hairy real fast. This study found increasing your processed food consumption 10% increases overall cancer risk 12%. It found that increasing your processed food 10% increased breast cancer risk 11%. So if you're worried about the breast cancer, a modifiable risk factor is processed food consumption, and you can decrease it. One other thing that they looked at is the relative contribution of each food group to processed food. Sugary products make up 26% of the processed foods that Americans are consuming. Processed drinks like sodas make up 20%. Breakfast cereals and starchy foods 16%. So those are the major ones that you want to reduce and eliminate. So today's nugget is a mind blower, because as processed food grows in the industry and more people consume more of it, they're saying we're predicting a higher rate of cancer in the coming decades. Cancer is already pushing heart disease for the #1 cause of death in the United States. So how could we decrease cancer deaths? decrease ultra-processed food consumption.